In this video, we'll learn about understanding the normal pulmonary physiology in the context of bronchial asthma. Uh, you know, in this diagram, you can observe trachea is considered as generation zero. Like all the airways have been numbered as they've been given a generation number, that is G0 to 23 is the alveoli. Trachea is considered as generation zero as it bifurcates into the main bronchi, then into lobar bronchi, segment bronchi, and further into smaller bronchioles like then terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar duct, and alveolus. What exactly happens in asthma is here the generation 10 to 16 is affected most commonly. So this is a diagram which shows clearly the different generations. If you can observe, the trachea is considered as generation 0. Next, the first bifurcation becomes the first generation. Next comes the lobar bronchus becomes the second generation, and so on till the alveoli. Okay, it has been dividing 23 times, so we have 23 generations has been numbered. Clear? In asthma, what happens is it mostly affects the smaller airways. So what exactly is a smaller airway, we'll see now. And if you can see here, what has happened is alveoli is present only in the respiratory bronchioles. These structures here, which have some alveoli shown, this is alveolar sac if you want to enlarge here. So this is a terminal bronchiole. They don't have any alveoli. Okay, the alveoli starts in the respiratory bronchioles. 17th generation onwards, the alveoli appear on the bronchioles here. These are called respiratory bronchioles. Down, if you can see here, this whole thing is alveolar sac, and individual bubble-like appearance. What you're seeing is one alveoli. So the gas exchange happens from 17th generation down till 23rd generation. Gas exchange happens. But what exactly all these airways are doing is conducting the air to different parts of the lungs. So this is called a conducting zone till the 16th generation. 17th to 23rd generation we call it as respiratory zone. Now, as I was telling, in asthma, the generations 10th to 16th generation of bronchioles are affected. So asthma is primarily a disease of the small airways affecting the generation 10 to 16, where the terminal bronchioles are the most affected due to their anatomical vulnerability and immunological activity. Now, question would be why trachea and main bronchi are the bigger airways are not involved. Okay, here if you can observe this diagram, there is a C-shaped cartilage and the diameter is also quite big. Okay, so what happens is even though there is some inflammation and these muscles try to undergo, it will not cause bronchoconstriction. Effective obstruction to airflow is not there in if these airways are involved, because they have a cartilaginous support to these trachea, bronchioles, and all that. Okay, so always remember that bronchi and trachea are not involved because they have a cartilaginous support and that provides stability. For that reason, it cannot collapse very easily, and they also have a very less smooth muscle here, and there is limited immune cell infiltration in these areas. And also the terminal segments, as I was telling, the gas exchange zone, no, the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs, these are not involved. The terminal portion where gas exchange happens, because if you see, it is very thin layer of cells is present in the alveoli, very like it is very closely approximated with the blood vessel, which has RBCs. So when oxygen enters and carbon dioxide leaves here, we need a very thin membrane. The thickness, if it is more, again it will obstruct the gas exchange. So what has happened is, evolution wise, we see there are no smooth muscles here, because if it is there, then it might obstruct the gas exchange. And also remember, there is lack of mucus glands. Why the mucus gland is because, see, one of the important characteristic feature of bronchial asthma is bronchoconstriction. The other one is mucus production. There is excessive mucus production. So here, since this gas exchange zone, they don't have any mucus glands, so there is no production of mucus, and there is a minimal airway resistance contribution. That is because, remember, the surface area is very big. That's why there's a minimal airway resistance in this gas exchange zones. So you would have understood by now the trachea, bronchi till the 10th generation, the segments, no, these airway is not affected in bronchial asthma because they have cartilaginous support and it cannot easily collapse. At the same time, the terminal portion is also not involved. The extremes like 17th generation down till the alveoli is not involved because they don't have any smooth muscles, because when the smooth muscle contracts, that is when the bronchoconstriction happens. Now the question would be, I told you like 10th to 16th generation is most commonly affected, but terminal bronchiole is the main site of lesion where the asthma affects. Okay, why so? Because bronchioles, they don't have cartilage. Clear? So the caliber of these airways should be maintained by a very rich smooth muscle layer. And also they have lot of goblet cells in this terminal bronchioles, which will produce more and more mucus. So if you can observe this diagram here, this is a trachea where this is a cartilaginous ring. So as you see, the C-shaped rings have been disintegrated and they just form a plates here and there and they produce stability. As it comes down, these bronchioles, they don't have any cartilaginous plates. So what is present in this is actually only the smooth muscles. And it is the relaxation of the smooth muscle which will keep the airways open here. As it comes down, respiratory bronchioles and all complete smooth muscles are also not there. So when I tell when initially I mentioned your asthma is a small airway disease. Small airway meaning so caliber of these trachea and all if you observe it's somewhere about 16 to 18 mm is the internal diameter of trachea. As it comes down here, the terminal bronchioles and all no the bronchiole caliber is very close to like 2 mm. So below down, no, it is less than 2 mm in internal diameter. That is where the air passes. But somewhere here, it may be around 10 mm or something like that. Okay. So and they don't have any cartilaginous plate in bronchioles, and that is the main characteristic feature to differentiate between a bronchi from a bronchioles. You can read here. Cartilage in the airway is present down till the 10th generation. I told you from 10th downwards only we get asthma because till then cartilage was there to somehow support to maintain the internal diameter. But beyond this point, the airways become bronchioles, which typically lack cartilage and they rely on smooth muscle for airway patency. So till now you have got an idea that in healthy lungs, the smooth muscles are fully relaxed and this is a normal airway. If you can see the internal diameter is like or the airways are open. But in asthma, what happens is two things what we studied here. One is the smooth muscles are constricted around the trachea and also there is lot of mucus production. So that will lead to already the caliber is reduced because of the constriction. Now imagine some mucus also is blocking this airway that will further compromise airflow in asthma patients. So now to learn about the smooth muscle here, in this diagram you can see a normal bronchiole and you can see a strap-like arrangement of smooth muscle. It is not a complete sheet of smooth muscle what we see in the airways. It usually just a thin strap-like arrangement of smooth muscle is seen and inside you can see the mucus and below that you can see submucosa and the typical respiratory epithelium also you can observe here. So if you see the histological cut section, this is a bronchiole and you can just observe only on the upper side there is some smooth muscles present here. As you go low on all these areas we don't have any smooth muscles. So I think it is very clear for you guys here. It's only on the few areas they have smooth muscles and that is enough to keep the airways open or constrict. Okay, so the caliber can change accordingly by these constriction or relaxation of these smooth muscles. So in asthma now what happens is in a normal airway, if you can observe, the smooth muscles are fully relaxed. The tone of the smooth muscle is very less. But in asthma patients, even when a person doesn't have any acute exacerbation of asthma, the smooth muscles are slightly tightened. Okay, they are hyper responsive. Any slight an allergen comes, this can undergo a severe vasoconstriction. So you can see here during an acute attack of asthma or a flare up, what has happened is severely tightened smooth muscle. So that itself will compromise the airflow. Now to understand the mucosal layer here, there's just a diagrammatic representation of first mucosal layer. Just observe here, there is an epithelial cell and a goblet cell. The goblet cell produces mucus and the mucus is just lining the epithelium. And in the submucosa, you have a mast cell and eosinophil. This is a normal epithelium. Okay, normally these are present because any exposure to allergen happens, eosinophil releasing immunoglobulins, all that, and it will start its function. But in case of asthma, what happens to all these cells we'll observe here. Just observe this diagram. This is a respiratory epithelium. What you need to understand here is this is a goblet cell. And the goblet cell inside, they're in green color, they've represented mucin containing vesicles within the goblet cell. And these epithelial cells are all ciliated cell. And there is some green colored mucus shown here. Okay, and the mucus, if you see, it is two layered. One is light green, other one is slightly yellowish, right? So the slightly yellowish mucus, what is present is usually a gel-like substance, meaning it is slightly thicker. It is more viscous, slightly thick in consistency, something like a gel. Okay, the one which is present here in a light green color, it is slightly solution kind of thing. It is like less viscous. It easily flows. Okay, that is because see cilia is embedded in this uh, type of mucus. So what happens is when a cilia can easily move around, so it is slightly less viscous mucin is present around cilia. On the topmost layer is actually very thick or a viscous mucus is present. That is because when a dust or allergen comes, the mucus layer will trap, and when cilia moves easily, it will all be pushed to the upper respiratory tract. So this mucus is present, produced by the submucosal glands, and goblet cell also produces this mucus here. Now, just observe the number of goblet cells in this diagram here, which is shown here. We have only three goblet cells, right? Now, what happens is in asthma patients, there is goblet cell hyperplasia. When I tell hyperplasia, it is nothing but increase in the cell number. So you can observe here the epithelial cells from this diagram has been replaced by a goblet cell here. Clear? And also there's a basement membrane thickening, and the mucus also you can see there's overproduction because the number of goblet cells has increased. At the same time, submucosal gland has undergone hypertrophy. So these are some of the changes which you see in asthma. Now the question is how the goblet cell hyperplasia or why the goblet cell hyperplasia is happening, right? There's something called transdifferentiation of epithelial cells into a goblet cell. Normally, you know the term differentiation of a cell, meaning differentiation of a cell, meaning, for example, we'll take a stem cell. A stem cell is an immature germ cell, right? So this, not a germ cell, it's an immature cell which can differentiate into any type of mature cell. It can either form an RBC, WBC, epithelial cell, or goblet cell. It can form any type of cell if it undergoes differentiation. But when I tell the term transdifferentiation, it means one mature cell transforming into another mature cell. We call it as transdifferentiation. This process is transdifferentiation. So just differentiation meaning an immature cell forming a mature cell. That is an differentiation process. Here transdifferentiation meaning a mature cell converting itself into another mature cell. We call it as transdifferentiation. So in the previous diagram we saw epithelials, in place of epithelial cells we all have now goblet cells in asthma patients. So that process of conversion is called transdifferentiation. And some of the factors or pathways is clearly shown here, but let us not go into so much detail here. What I want you to understand here is whenever any the airway injury happens, there'll be some growth factors released, okay, like transforming growth factor, epidermal growth factor, some oxygen free radicals. All this, what they'll do is they will signal the epithelial cell and the inhibit apoptosis. The cell will survive. Now if it has another signal, if it is received from interleukin 13, that is nothing but from the T helper cell. This is again a type of helper cell releasing an interleukin. That signal now converts a epithelial cell into a goblet cell. So now the goblet cell transformation has happened. So this goblet cell, now what it will do is, the process is called as transdifferentiation. Okay. So this goblet cell now produces mucin. The mucin is actually what is all these are called mucin containing vesicles. Okay. The mucin, once it goes out, released out of a cell, once it combines with water, it forms what is called mucus. Okay, these are all mucin producing genes. Goblet cell actually produces mucin. Mucin will imbibe water and convert itself into a gel like mucus. Okay, so that's how the goblet cell functions. So you would have understood why there is increased production of mucus in asthma patients. That is because all the epithelial cells, because of some stimulus, they're converting itself, or they're undergoing transdifferentiation into a goblet cell which produces more and more mucus. And also remember, eosinophil also starts increasing in these asthma patients. If you see the histology of this bronchial airways in asthma patients, there will be a lot of infiltration by eosinophils. So normal function of eosinophil is to produce all this, release these granules. See, all these are granules, and these granules will have major basic protein, eosinophilic cationic protein and all. So all of them will be released out, and that will participate in wound healing. It influences fibroblastic activity and releasing growth factors. But what happens in asthma patients is there will be these eosinophils are recruited in excess by the lungs uh, to the lungs with the help of an interleukin 5. So they will release major basic protein and all. So see, this is normally present. Some amount of major basic protein, eosinophilic cationic protein, everything will be released. It is something like, see, there is a plant. You have sprayed little bit pesticides, okay, which will help in survival of the plant, right? It removes all the pests. But if it is sprayed in excess, what can happen is it itself can damage the plant. The same applies here also. Eosinophil, when it is in minimal in number, it releases cytotoxic granules like major basic protein, eosinophilic cationic protein, and all. All this can help us in repair of the whatever the injury has happened. But if it is sprayed in excess, or if it is released in excess by an eosinophil, as happens in asthma, that itself will cause inflammation, and it will promote the goblet cell hyperplasia and mucus production. Mast cell also is an inflammatory cell. This normally releases granules which contains histamine, right? Normal role of histamine is vasodilation, increased vascular permeability, smooth muscle contraction, and mucus secretion. So you can see here, if it causes smooth muscle contraction, again it is nothing but bronchoconstriction, which is a characteristic feature of asthma. Excessive mucus production is also a characteristic feature of asthma. And when there is vasodilation, increased vascular permeability, what happens is there's a mucosal edema. All this can compromise airflow. So in asthma, when a person is exposed to an allergen, there is activation of mast cell, at the same time activation of eosinophils. Both will cause bronchoconstriction and inflammation. So just observe the epithelium here. So this is a normal epithelial cell with a few goblet cell, but you just observe here there is goblet cell hyperplasia, right? And that is because of interleukin 13. This is what I was telling you. There's a trans differentiation of epithelial cells into a goblet cells, and that will produce large amount of mucus. And the inflammation, what you see, is predominantly eosinophilic infiltration. So that's why we also call it as eosinophilic inflammation, which is very typical of bronchial asthma. That is because of interleukin 5. And we all know asthma is an obstructive lung disorder. It obstructs the airflow. Okay. So now the question is, see, this is an airway. There is some amount of blockage by the mucus, whatever. This yellow color represents a mucus. Okay. There is excessive mucus production. So there is some partial blockage of this airway. And this is your alveoli. So when a person inspires, remember, your alveoli expands, right? Now, neighboring to these airways also there will be alveoli on the left side, right side. So when an alveoli tries to expand or move in this direction, what happens is it will slightly pull open your airways. So slight opening is still present, and air can easily move into the alveoli. So during the process of inspiration, air can still enter the alveoli. But when a person starts expiring, so what happens is alveoli is compressed, and there is blockage of this airway because your airways also gets compressed, because as a whole all the alveoli will be collapsing, and the lung parenchyma is becoming smaller and smaller because it want to push out or exhale the air. So when that happens, the airway which are embedded within the lung parenchyma also gets collapsed. So the partial blockage which was there during inspiration now becomes a complete blockade, and air gets trapped within the alveoli. So usually in most of the obstructive lung disorders, no, the problem will be during expiration, because inspiration still the caliber of all these patency of the airways will open, increase slightly, but in case of expiration they will fully close it off. So just to summarize, in what we studied till now, this is a normal airway. You can observe there is a smooth muscles are fully relaxed. Same thing observe here, the smooth muscles are constricted, they undergo spasm, and the interleukin responsible for that is interleukin 4. And if you observe the respiratory epithelium, there are a few goblet cells which normally produce mucus, which will help us in trapping the allergen or dust particles. And there is some amount of your inflammatory cells present here. But in asthma, there is an exaggerated process here. What happens is goblet cell hyperplasia. There is mucus hypersecretion that itself will block the airway as it is shown here. That is because of interleukin 13. And there is typically eosinophilic inflammation because of interleukin 5. Just to summarize, it affects the small airways. Remember, generation 10 to 16, and smooth muscles are hyper responsive here. There is increased inflammation. Typically, we call it as eosinophilic inflammation, and the goblet cells are increased in number, and the goblet cell will produce excessive mucus production. And it's an obstructive asthma is an obstructive lung disorder, so it's a problem of expiration. So in asthma, the characteristic features are bronchoconstriction. So you have understood now why the smooth muscles are like what you call that, like because the initial tone itself is very high, they are hyper responsive in asthma patients, so easily they can undergo bronchoconstriction. And there is excessive mucus production because of goblet cell hyperplasia, and the mucus itself will partially block the airways. So another typical feature what you see in bronchial asthma is airway inflammation, and that inflammation is typically eosinophilic inflammation. And eosinophil releases IgE that will further like what you call that at the chemical level there will be a lot of activation of inflammation. The inflammatic process will start, okay, within the submucosal layer. So all this will precipitate asthma.